Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of New Books Network. This is Morteza Hajizadeh, your host from Critical Theory Channel. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with Dr. Hannah Forsyth. Dr. Hannah Forsyth is a historian at the Australian Catholic University, and she was also the president of Australian and New Zealand History of Education Society. Her first book was called The History of Modern Australian University, and the second book that she published is called Virtue Capitalists: The Rise and Fall of Professional Class in Anglophone World, 1870 to 2008. The book was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. Uh, Hannah, welcome to New Books Network.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we start the interview, can you just briefly introduce yourself and your field of expertise, and more importantly, why you decided to write this book? What was the story behind writing the book?
Yeah, look, and I should clarify that since the blurb that is on the back of the book that you just very kindly read, I have left the Australian Catholic University. I'm still adjunct associate professor there, but I'm now working part-time at Jobs and Skills Australia, but I'm not representing them in any way, I should say. That's the federal government body. Over the last 10 years, I grew my research from the history of education, which is where I started, and why the first book was the history of universities that came out of my PhD, into thinking about the reasons that universities grew so crazily over the past few decades. So if they doubled in size from 2000 until 2020 worldwide. And when I finished the first book, I was thinking about the reasons that universities grew so much and wanting to understand better the kind of economic foundations for that kind of growth. To me, that the big change over the course of what I've come to call the long 20th century, kind of drawing on Giovanni Arrighi, is the growth of the profession. So from a very tiny proportion of the labour market in 130 years ago, 150 years ago, to a very high proportion of the labour force now. Has been the growth of that white collar work. So I began really out of thinking about universities and wanting to shift into this. And that shift was quite considerable because economic and the labour history is a bit different to educational history. And so it took quite a long time for me to develop some new skills to be able to do that. And that was kind of fun.
Let's talk about the title of the book, Virtue Capitalists. What does it mean? What does it refer to? Who are virtue capitalists?
Yes, thanks. It took me a little while of doing the research before I came to the place of seeing that virtue was sitting at the center of what professional work was seeking. And what I realized in the process of looking at, particularly in that early period, it was much more obvious than it is a bit later, but I think it still applies. Professionals were, so we're talking about white collar workers, doctors, lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, teachers, and certainly in the early period, nurses, social workers, and that sort of thing. That what they were seeking to do was to build a society that would profit from virtue. So the virtue that they were imagining was interior to them, so it was part of their character. And by doing the work that they were doing, they were investing that virtue in the economy, and they expected to receive a profit for themselves in the form of kind of prospects and a stable career and a relatively good income. In some professions, better income than others, but also a return to society. And so all of the professions had a series of virtues that kind of worked together in a constellation with the other professions in a way. So, teachers were very big on temperance, and accountants on probity, engineering on accuracy, and so on. And that they invested that virtue into the economy by doing the work, and that the kind of profit that would be realized would be shared by themselves and also the rest of society.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I liked about the book is that it's one of the few academic books that talks about Melbourne. And so this rise of let's say, class of professionals. It was not a, let's say, localized phenomenon because you discussed different countries. So it was sort of a transnational phenomenon, let's say, right?
Yeah, it was. I was am an Australian historian by training, and and an Australian by accent, as you can hear. Um, so I began in Australia, but I realised after a while it made no sense to examine these professionals only in Australia, and particularly, I guess, because Australia is a little peripheral to the rest of the Anglophone world. It doesn't feel that way when we live here, but we have to recognise that in some ways. But what I realised was that the ways that we've understood both the growth of education and the professionalization of the economy has been imagined as if these economies are on kind of railroad tracks next to one another, that they're all moving together, and some are just a little ahead of the others. But if we stop thinking, and really that's been about comparing the US and Britain, understandably big centres, but when you do that, you miss something really important, and that is that the settler colonial world was doing something altogether. And they weren't, while they were separate places in many ways, and the United States was particularly separate, having had a revolution, but they were also deeply united. And so the classes of people that were growing both in kind of administering what was becoming a modern state, but particularly in trying to grow a new world economy, they were communicating with one another all the time. They were moving around together, and they were really part of the same thing. So it's certainly a transnational thing. And they were deeply connected to Britain, of course. But so for example, one of the statistics that's often seen is that education grew very quickly in the United States, not so much in Britain. Now, the educational historians in Britain say, well, we were not that different to Europe. But when I had a look across Canada, Australia, and New Zealand and compared them to the United States, it was obvious that all of those were growing at a similar kind of pace. So it was different to Britain, but they were very similar to one another.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also interested to know the role of the investments from the City of London, because that's also what you discuss in about the rise of this moral middle class and also these professions with the help of the investments from City of London.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I've been thinking about it a little bit just this last week, actually. And it's central to the story of Melbourne. The kind of rise of marvelous Melbourne is the story, really, of that massive inflow of investment from the City of London into Melbourne. And so a section of the book focuses on Melbourne because the inflow is very obvious. There's so few people in Melbourne at that time that the amount of investment per person was just enormous. And so that, because in those settler colonies, it's really this middle class that is spread throughout the former British Empire, administering and doing other things, that are in charge. All that money flows in, and it's flowing in to invest in particular things, mining often, railroads and other things. But because all this cash is there, the local middle class then is investing that locally in things that they care about. And, top of their list is human capital development. So education and healthcare for a kind of much more mobile middle class across the settler colonies. But as well, growing professions like accountancy, the law, surveying is really important in a growing colony, engineering and so on. So all of those things were part of the surge in kind of human capital and in kind of economic development in all of the settler colonies through that late 19th century period.
And what was the role of morality and moral values? You did touch upon that. How were these moral values infused in these occupations? And I think it worked a little bit different in settler colonies, and it would be great if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, of course, what characterized the British middle class right from the beginning was the centrality of morality. So it was different to the other classes, certainly different to the kind of imagined dissolute elite aristocracy, and then imagined to be different to the kind of lawless working class. So their kind of uprightness was what they believed that they carried with them. at home in England as well as across all of the settler colonies. But the settler colonies were a little different because they carried a lot more anxieties with them. So there's the sheer lack of legitimacy of stealing First Nations land in order to build new colonies, and that is quite evidently felt throughout much of colonization, not by everybody, but it is there. Even if legitimacy was considered to be a given, the fear of a kind of savage presence was particularly potent in all of the settler colonies. You might say Australia, a little bit New Zealand, with convicts as well. There's a lot of anxiety about the moral future of those colonies. And so the moral middle class is there and sees themselves as part of their role of bringing the colonies into a moral foundation. And that moral foundation is not separate from the economic development that they're also wanting to see happen.
What about the idea of merit? In the part of your book, you discussed the idea of merit, how it developed, that idea of merit developed in regards to these professions. I'm interested to know what merit actually meant for them and how was it used as a stepping stone to success and upward mobility in this class of professions.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, merit is a moral idea, isn't it? Rather than coming into a position of privilege because of your birth or your wealth, merit shows that you have earned this. And this was something that the professional classes they developed was deeply committed to. Now, they were deeply committed to that as a moral stance, but also as one that would regulate their professions. And so it was really central to the ideas of medicine as it was growing, which had been kind of bound up with old ideas about honour and so on. But those were becoming kind of regulated standards that you expected of all the other members of your profession. And so in order to regulate that merit, the education systems became more and more standardised. So while you would once have learned your profession from a person or in practice in a very particular location, that generally meant then that you only knew how to do it there and didn't have the full breadth of experience that might be expected in perhaps a more mobile population. So that this led to the growth of kind of standardized curricula slowly and not evenly across the professions, but slowly a kind of standardized curricula. Generally, the professions were managing this themselves, but through entrance exams and other forms of examination. But gradually, they all moved into universities over time, some very late. Nursing in Australia didn't enter universities until the 1980s. Whereas others were much earlier than that. But the ways then that merit was both the measure and the reward of your effort going into the profession enabled each of the professions to form hierarchies. And some of those hierarchies were very visible. Again, with the nurses, you think that about the caps and veils that were different for each level that you were ascended in the process of progressing in your career. Sometimes lawyers have similarly kind of still have some similarly elaborate gear that reflects their status in this. In fact, I have my academic gown just over there that also does that, right? And so the hierarchies that were built through the societies were also built in part by the forms of merit that the professional class were bringing into education, and as well as they're internal to the professions.
And I think that's where you discuss the new forms of inequality in terms of race and gender, because this idea of merit sort of enhanced these different forms or led to, inadvertently might have led to these different forms of inequality or in genders and race, right?
Sometimes it's not inadvertent at all. I think sometimes this is how it was done on purpose. So often enough, if we think of each of the professions as having a jurisdiction that they're wanting to control, and that includes letting some people in and regulating who those people are and keeping some people out. Now, the ideal of merit suggests that you're doing that on the basis of systems that are rational and reasonable, right? But that's not always the case. So the types of things that are being measured even today in examinations are often enough a measure of class status, sometimes gender, sometimes race. So if we think about the ways that middle-class nurses were seeking to push out working-class nurses of the kind of Siri Gamp type that they remembered from Dickens, that they that they used their examinations to test for a class status in this, and they probably didn't need to test for a gender status, but they did that anyway by including questions about women's work and duty and things like that. Medicine had its first job of keeping out the homeopaths, of keeping out other forms of medicine that had sometimes been dominated by women, and so they're actively excluding things that were by gender, but also by race. So Chinese medicine that was I would suggest, at least as effective as Western medicine in the late 19th century, was actively being discriminated against eventually. But for all that, at first, in fact, many Westerners saw Chinese medical specialists, sometimes even on Harley Street in London. But that process of exclusion was one of the consequences of merit. And so merit then, by building a system of hierarchy that sees itself as being the objective measure of inequality, helps to build forms of inequality. Some of that is about, while merit is supposed to be about things that are achieved, sometimes they don't believe that some things can be achieved. So gender, for example, and race are among those. And the belief that both people of particular genders and people of particular races have innate qualities that makes them good or bad at particular things also contributed to that.
And when I was reading this book, before I got to the chapter where you talk about whether we can consider them workers or not, or working class, so, which is an interesting question. I'll wait for you to answer that. These people are not this class of professionals. They were employed. They received salaries. They were obviously not owners of the capital, but can we consider them to be working class? Because and the interesting part that I really like, and I would love for you to talk about that, is that these people also helped the expansion of those corporates that they were working in, which makes it a little bit more complicated, I guess, to answer the question.
Yeah, it is complicated, and there's not as straightforward an answer as I would like to give. So sometimes, I would say, is probably the short answer. The longish answer is that there's if we think that the professional class consists of a hierarchy of its own making, there's considerable overlap on both ends, with capital on one end and the working class on the other. So, for example, there are plenty of engineers. We might think of Herbert Hoover when he came over from America to work at Broken Hill at Zinc Corporation. He is an engineer, and he's bringing that engineering expertise to the work, but really he's a capitalist. Right? And so are most of the other people that he's working with, for all that they're also stockbrokers and journalists and so on. So the relationship to capital is a little fuzzy at the top end. At the bottom end, the relationship to capital or to labour is also a little fuzzy. And if we think about the changes to nursing, perhaps in particular, that we might increasingly consider many nurses to be working class over the course of the 20th century. I think, and what we can see too is that while most professions became salaried, many were not early on. Many were kind of small businesses or independent practitioners. As they became more salaried, their relationship to capital changed, but not perfectly. So while they end up in some forms of relationship to managers, especially that in a way that does resemble labour versus capital, they also don't belong at the same dinner party as the working class. And so being able to see the ways that their class consciousness and their class interests can sometimes align with either capital or labour, but also often diverge from those, tells us that this is an unstable set of relationships, but one in which there is some often distinct class interests that the professionals hold on their own.
What about welfare state? These people, well, because you discussed the role of morality and virtue capitalists, so the idea is that they're progressive people supportive of welfare state initiatives, such as establishment of national health care. But
Yeah.
it was interesting to me that I read that some of them were actually, some of the doctors were against these welfare initiatives, or the establishment of healthcare, for example, national healthcare in Canada. So can you first maybe generally talk about the relationship of this new class of professionals with the state in terms of support they provide to the people, welfare programs, and also the example of Canadian national healthcare system?
Yeah. Look, in some ways, when I first started this out with this, I imagined that it would be possible to tell a story about professionals and the state as if they were always entangled. That that the rise of the welfare state was in some ways an expression of this professional ideal, and that's not wholly wrong, but it's also way more complicated than that. So while we've got the modern state emerging in the settler colonies with this class of people in charge, of course, there's enormous overlap between both parliamentarians, the running of the state, of course, the whole entirety of the rule of law, the importance of journalism to the growth of those democracies, all that sort of thing. But so they're kind of instrumentally important in the emergence of the modern state. That does not mean that they are always aligned with the interests of the modern state as those interests develop, nor with one another. So, and doctors in particular are very successful in most places at protecting their independence from the state, and that independence is seen by them, as it is for academics actually, to be kind of central to their professional standing. And I think something very similar to the way that academics balk at too much state interference in even the running of their universities. So, that's become a lesser thing that they're able to control. And see that independence as being crucial to their academic freedom, and that academic freedom is important to the integrity of the work. So you can hear all the virtue that goes into the reasoning, right? Doctors have something similar, where, in fact, most of the professions have something similar. It's just doctors have tended to be a bit more powerful in order to ensure it. Doctors have often genuinely believed that if the state, though they should have been watching for the insurance companies just as much as the state, had too much say over their work, then they wouldn't be able to work as efficaciously or as honestly and with the kind of integrity that they needed to do their job. So the relationship to the state has just not been as smooth as I expected from the beginning. It was also not one of the criticisms that I've heard about the book is that it didn't acknowledge that most of the people were state employees, and that's just not the case. So even under compulsory schooling, and with the expansion of kind of colonial governments, even most engineers are not working directly for government, let alone school teachers are not. Nurses are mostly not working for government. So the state as an employer doesn't really begin to come into being until the 1930s, and it's much less the case altogether in the United States than it is anywhere else.
What was the relationship with unions?
Yeah, so most that's a little variable, but most professions were wary of unionism. This was such a symbol of the kind of dirty working class that they didn't want to be, that they most frequently rejected unionism altogether. There were some exceptions. A few groups of nurses unionized early, a few groups of teachers, certainly the younger teachers. Young teachers were teenagers in that early on, and they were often very, very exploited and paid very poorly, and working very long hours, and so they tended to unionize. It's really under the welfare state that unions start to become a way of expressing their solidarity with one another and of achieving particular outcomes for professional working conditions and so on.
In the book, you have this really interesting example in Australia where with professional engineers case and the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission. So it would be good if you could talk about that example.
Yeah. We're lucky in this respect. So when we're trying to look for class consciousness, can be a difficult thing to find in the archives, right? So and we know that we want to see it, that we can't really validate the existence of a class without seeing them expressing class consciousness in some way. And yet, what are the records that would show this? So very often we have to kind of go, well, they might have been a class, and sometimes you might be able to see evidence of it. But in this case, we've got excellent records that is just kind of a part of a consequence, really, of a quirk of Australia's legal oversight of industrial relations. So early on, since the Harvester judgment early in the 20th century, we've had this arbitration and conciliation, or I think it's actually conciliation and arbitration court, that's now, the remnants of that are now in the Fair Work Commission. So, and what that's done is enable the creation of a whole lot of records that would be otherwise unavailable to us. So in the late 1950s into the 1960s, the professional engineers, who were by then about 60% government employees, decided that they needed to unionize as a profession in order to secure improved pay rates, but also they wanted to elevate their status among other professionals as well. So it was this incredibly long court case, kind of more than 50 boxes of records sitting in the archives. And it went on and on and on. They made these people go and have a look at engineering works. They showed films. They brought in experts, and throughout it all, what they kept showing was what it meant to be middle class. So they wanted to be able to do the things that they wanted to show, that they were as educated as medicine and law. They wanted to show that they should have a lifestyle that was equivalent to that. So we can see the importance of consumption, the importance of association with others of the same class. They wanted to be recognised with others and dress in a similar way, and so on. So their consciousness of their shared interests was really important. The fact that more than half of them worked for government and the other half worked for private industry was the sticking point in the first place. And they had to establish that they were an industry together, even though some of them worked for profit and some were part of the welfare state. And so their relationship to the means of production was not the thing that made them a class. And so that was something that they had to demonstrate. And they were successful in establishing that engineering was indeed an industry and that they could unionize, and they also succeeded in elevating their salaries. I don't know how successful they were at their status. They were still complaining about it in the following decades. But what's important about it in Australian union history is that it was what enabled other professions to unionize along similar lines. So social workers and academics were next in line. So the union that I've most recently belonged to, the National Tertiary Education Union, is a consequence of that same case.
Earlier we discussed about the merit establishment of hierarchies and also sort of inequalities that came about as a result of that. And you also discussed the rise of anti-colonial movements. I'm interested to know how civil rights movements or anti-colonial movements helped expose the embedded racism or misogyny embedded in these professions.
Yeah, this is such an important watershed, really, in the history of professions. And a whole lot of our literature about professions comes from that moment, actually, because everyone was suddenly against them. And it did feel quite sudden. The coincidence, I think, with the economic shocks of the time can't be overlooked. But certainly we've got really from the end of the Second World War, as decolonization is beginning to spread, formal decolonization is beginning to spread throughout the world, grassroots anti-colonial movements that have been there for a lot longer but are really coming to the fore. We've got important transformations throughout Africa and in Algeria against France that leads into kind of the May 68 student protests and so on. So and then of course the Vietnam War. The consciousness of colonization has become really important broadly. And that those anti-colonial movements are informing other ways of thinking about liberation. Now, the relationship to the civil rights movement, which is a much longer standing grassroots movement that comes to the fore at a particular moment of the Cold War, when the United States is becoming anxious that decolonizing nations might look to the Soviet Union for inspiration rather than to them, where Jim Crow segregation is still in place. It begins to support kind of this continuing grassroots movement. So that causes a moral crisis for teachers in the first instance, that not only desegregating their schools, but are beginning to recognize the racism that was embedded in the system of merit that they are primarily responsible for. And so they're starting to think, okay, we need to train teachers differently. How do we even go about doing this? Answers start to arrive in the form of Paulo Freire's new critiques of pedagogy, that's directly derived from anti-colonial movements. Feminism, also inspired often enough by anti-racist and anti-colonial movements, is seeking women's liberation, people seeking gay liberation. So that results in criticisms of medicine. We've got the emergence of an environmental movement that pokes its fingers straight at engineering, that has been polluting the world and concreting over all of nature. All of those professions internalize this. They all see we've been working on this basis of virtue that has built actually all of the problems that we see around us. And so they all then kind of look inwards to see what they might need to do to change.
And again, the story in the book takes a very interesting shift. And that's where I kind of more identified with it, because I guess in today's workforce, it's more or less the same now. So there was this rise of new elite managerial class. They thought maybe the ideas of virtue and morality is kind of outdated, so they tried to discard with it. There was new, and it was replaced with the idea of success. And the famous motto, work smarter, not harder, which I guess beautifully also aligns, but beautiful, I'm using it in a sarcastic sense, with the neoliberal economy and trying to, save money and everything. So don't work harder, work smarter. So can you talk about this shift of ethics, let's say, or morality, and its replacement with success in this new managerial class?
Yeah. It's if we think that all of those professions are facing a moral crisis in the 1970s, for management, and I suspect also for bankers, who I'm keen to look at next, the moral crisis is in reverse. So management and banking have been sitting in a kind of very gentlemanly, staid place, where their moral place is about keeping things stable for some decades. Then all of a sudden, in the kind of shock of the globalizing economies after the currencies are now floating against each other, and that capital is now moving throughout the world in ways that are much less predictable before, this managerial class, or at least a group of decision makers, a larger group of decision makers, is urgently needed just to make those decisions. But the moral consequences of those decisions are the opposite of the ones that they've been upholding for the previous decade. So rather than trying to keep a stable, happy, healthy workforce, they are now looking at a flexible workforce that might mean that they need to sack half of their people at any given moment and move something offshore, make decisions that affect people negatively. And so a kind of toughness builds around the more difficult decisions that they're finding themselves needing to make. it's not quite all managers, because in fact some of them, and probably particularly those in government, are looking at the problems that the professions have caused and seeing themselves systematizing professional virtue in a way that would then take away they hoped to kind of undermine the self-interest that had been embedded in some of those professional virtues. So both of the things are working at the same time and really under the same kind of economic conditions. The toughness of managerial decision making becomes really very clearly associated with a kind of masculinity that there's a whole lot of pictures of those management types, often a little overweight, beautiful young woman standing next to them. Behind them is a swimming pool, some very fancy car, maybe a helicopter. The kind of symbols of opulence and of wealth and of success are very bound up in a kind of Hugh Hefner type masculinity. And that doesn't mean that all managers were in fact Hugh Hefner types, but the moral codes that grew with this new managerialism kind of demanded a kind of toughness that those were kind of the melodramatic exemplars of that. What that also meant was that the specific types of virtues that professions were seeking became generalized, and it was part of that systematizing process, rather than thinking that the good things about being a nurse or a teacher or a doctor were embedded in the individual. We would turn these into systems, and those systems could be managed. And what does a manager care about? Success. So that makes those systems transferable across different industries, across different professions, and it kind of turns management into a kind of much more generic skill. The smarter, not harder, really, the smarter refers to them. So that the idea is that they could make everything more productive and more efficient, but you just needed to bring in a consultant or bring in another manager. And so it kind of imagines the value of everything that's being produced to reside in these managerial decision making.
You're a historian, Hannah, and I always end my interviews with a question about how do you predict the future, for example. In this case, so I also work in an organization which is very similar to your organization, and yeah, I'm one of these new classes of professionals, but I also consider myself to be a working class person, where I may not be based on a very rigid theoretical description. But the question I have is, okay, how can this class, if we can consider most of them to be working class, how can they reverse these hierarchies that are built into their professional class? How can they bring in change regardless whether it benefits their own class interests or not?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking it. It's a really generous thing. Look, I think that there's probably a few different elements to this. One is the evident proletarianization of professional work since the rise of managerialism, and I think the link between kind of the hypermasculine values that came with success as the only virtue is infecting our politics to such a degree that we really must oppose it. I think that this is part of what is fueling the kind of clear rise of fascism worldwide and other things. It's making workplaces unbearable. It's making work life unsustainable. So I think that's where I would start. And I think that the right place to do that is by joining a union, as working people have since the Industrial Revolution. And I think in that sense that your intuition is the right pathway. The temptation for professionals, I think, is that we're all secretly technocrats, right? And I think is something that kind of comes about as a result of the relationship, the strong, if more ambiguous than expected, relationship with the state, but also about the kind of moral relationship between having expertise and using the expertise, so between knowing and doing. So it's tempting out of that to try to align the interests, really the imperative to oppose what I think has become an unacceptable managerial class, with a kind of wish to replace them in a technocratic sense. But so if management was the problem all along, and I think in some ways it was, that that seeking to control everything through in a way that puts ourselves, I'm saying that and I think we need to acknowledge this, that puts ourselves above others, and therefore with a stronger role in decision making. I think that is as much a problem for the professional class as it is for managers, for all that it doesn't look like it right at this moment. So kind of supplanting management and putting ourselves back in charge, I don't think is the right answer. But I do think that opposing it collectively and in alliance with the working class is really the only way forward at this point. Yeah.
Dr. Hannah Forsyth, thank you very much for your time to speak with us about your book on New Books Network. The book we discussed was called Virtual Capitalists, The Rise and Fall of Professional Class in Anglophone World, published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.